What would you do if the man in shackles before you was the boy who once held your heart? Judge Lillian Carter faces the trial of a lifetime, torn between justice and a haunting past. But as the evidence unfolds, so does a truth neither of them saw coming. Stay with us. This verdict changes everything. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The courtroom hummed with its usual rhythm, lawyers whispering hurriedly to their clients, the shuffle of papers, the distant murmur of voices waiting for justice to be served. Judge Lillian Carter sat at the bench, composed as always, her hands resting lightly on the polished oak. It was another case, another day in the slow grind of the legal system. But as the bailiff's voice rang out, announcing the next trial, a chill ran through her. The state of Louisiana versus Malcolm Turner. Lillian barely reacted on the outside, but inside, something twisted sharply in her chest. That name. It struck her like an echo from a past life, a voice she hadn't heard in decades. She forced herself to glance at the case file in front of her. Charges of assault, robbery, resisting arrest. It was all too familiar. A tragic, all too common pattern. Another black man lost in the system. Another defendant sitting in front of her, waiting for judgment. But when the door to the holding area opened and Malcolm Turner was escorted into the courtroom in shackles, Lillian felt the breath leave her lungs. She knew him, not just as a name on a case file, not just as another man caught in the endless cycle of arrests and accusations. She had known Malcolm once, as a friend. The years had changed him, but not completely. The boy she had once spent hours talking to under the magnolia trees of Hammond, Louisiana, was still in there. His shoulders had broadened, his face lined with hardships she couldn't even begin to imagine. But his eyes, deep, dark, and still burning with that same quiet intensity, were unmistakable. For the first time in her entire career, her grip on the gavel faltered. She had sentenced hundreds of men, some guilty, some she had wondered about, some whose names had faded as soon as the verdict was read. But this was Malcolm. He lifted his gaze and their eyes met. Recognition flickered across his face, but he quickly looked away. Whether it was shame, anger, or something else entirely, she wasn't sure. The courtroom seemed to shrink, the weight of the past pressing against her. She swallowed, forcing her voice to remain steady. "Mr. Turner, you stand accused of assault and robbery. How do you plead?" Malcolm's voice, rough but unwavering, cut through the air like a blade. "Not guilty, Your Honor." Lillian exhaled, her hands tightening against the bench. This was not just another case. This was personal. In the minutes after Malcolm Turner uttered the words, "not guilty," Judge Lillian Carter could hardly breathe. The courtroom was still moving, still breathing, still unfolding as though nothing had happened. But inside her, the world had shifted. As the prosecutor launched into a dry recital of opening arguments, Lillian's mind was already unraveling threads she'd tried to forget. How could she forget Hammond, Louisiana, the dusty sidewalks, the divided neighborhoods, the nights when two kids sat under a canopy of stars, daring to dream of a future bigger than their zip code? Lillian had grown up in a modest two-bedroom house with chipped white paint and a well-kept garden, the picture of quiet southern propriety. But it was the field behind that garden and the fence that separated her world from Malcolm's that had shaped her more than any courtroom ever could. Malcolm had lived just across that field, in a house that sagged under the weight of too many years and too little money. His family struggled, like most in his part of town. Lillian's parents never said it outright, but the message was clear. Their friendship was frowned upon. Still, it blossomed in secrecy. Born from a chance meeting when she'd wandered too close to the fence and gotten her dress snagged in the wire. Malcolm had helped untangle her, wordlessly, gently, and from that moment on, he'd been her anchor. He saw the world for what it was. "They already got plans for us," he once told her when they were 12, lying on their backs, staring up at the clouds. "You'll leave this town. They'll make sure I don't." I accept it, Elaine told himself. You'll leave this town. They'll make sure I don't. But she had laughed, insisting they'd both leave. She didn't know, then, the weight of the world he was already carrying. The invisible net of suspicion that trailed him into every store, every classroom, every sidewalk. The judgment cast before a word left his lips. Their friendship had been real, but it had also been fragile. One summer, when she was 15, her father had caught them on the porch together. His voice had been sharp, cruel. "Get inside, Lillian, now!" She'd frozen. Malcolm had looked at her with an expression she'd never forget. Not anger, not even sadness, but something deeper. "It's all right," he said, stepping back. "I'll see you around." But he hadn't. His family moved a few months later, and Lillian never heard from him again. Now, decades later, he was sitting in her courtroom in shackles. The prosecutor's voice grew louder, urging the jury to see Malcolm not as a man, but as a set of charges. Assault, robbery, resisting arrest. A convenience store clerk had been injured. Money had been stolen. Malcolm had been found nearby. It all looked so tidy on paper. But Lillian knew life was never tidy. She stared at the man in front of her. His shoulders were heavier. His skin was weathered. But those eyes still carried the same fire and pain and questions. The gavel was heavy in her hand. She wasn't supposed to feel anything. She wasn't supposed to remember, but how could she not? This was Malcolm, the boy who once gave her a magnolia blossom to cheer her up after her dog died. The boy who said, "I see the world for what it is, but that doesn't mean I'll stop fighting to be more." Lillian's stomach knotted as the prosecutor closed his statement, a sterile summary of a life reduced to assumptions. And she realized then, this wasn't just about justice. It was about whether justice could ever truly exist in a system that had written people like Malcolm out long before they stepped into a courtroom. The next morning, the tension inside the courtroom was thick enough to cut. As sunlight filtered through the high windows, casting long shadows across the oak-paneled walls, the defense attorney, Camille Rhodes, stood to begin her case. Young but fiercely composed, she carried herself with the kind of determination that made people listen, especially in moments like this. She adjusted her blazer, stepped forward, and addressed the jury, her voice clear but edged with urgency. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, "this trial is not just about what happened in a convenience store one night. It's about what we choose to see and what we choose to ignore." Judge Lillian Carter leaned slightly forward, her fingers curled around her gavel, watching as Camille called her first witness. Officer Brad Whitmore, the man who had arrested Malcolm Turner. A tall, broad-shouldered officer in his late 40s, Brad took the stand with the kind of practiced confidence that came from years of unchallenged authority. But Camille wasn't intimidated. She approached the stand with a calm fire in her eyes. "Officer Whitmore," she said, "you were the one who detained my client on the night in question, correct?" "Yes," he replied flatly. "And where was he when you found him?" "2 blocks from the store, walking alone." "Did you witness the crime yourself?" "No." "Did Mr. Turner resist arrest?" A pause. He asked why he was being detained. "That's not uncommon." Camille tilted her head. "Did he flee, raise his voice, threaten you in any way?" "No." "Yet you handcuffed him on the spot." Brad's jaw tightened. He matched the description. Camille raised her eyebrows. The description being, male, black, mid-40s, wearing dark clothes. Camille turned to the jury. "Just to clarify, no red hoodie, which the eyewitness mentioned, and no stolen money found on him. Correct?" "Correct," Whitmore muttered. "And yet he was arrested on the spot." Camille let the silence linger before delivering the blow. "Officer, were any surveillance tapes reviewed before this arrest?" "No, that was handled afterward." "Was the surrounding area canvassed for the red hoodie or other suspects?" "No." "Thank you." She turned to the judge. "No further questions, Your Honor." Whitmore's confidence visibly cracked as he stepped down, and for the first time, Lillian saw a flicker of something shift in the jury. Uncertainty. But Camille wasn't done. She called her next witness, a forensic video analyst named Marcus Leal. A quiet, precise man with wire-rimmed glasses and a calm demeanor, he presented the court with a digital analysis of the store's surveillance footage. He enlarged the grainy video, frame by frame, explaining the metadata embedded in the file. This footage, he explained, has a modified timestamp. Based on data inconsistencies, the original time appears to have been altered. The prosecutor, Alan Mercer, objected. Speculation. But Camille was ready. The witness is a certified forensic analyst. His findings are supported by digital audit logs and industry standards. Judge Carter nodded. Overruled. Continue. Marcus went on. Additionally, the individual in the footage, while similar in build, is several inches shorter than Mr. Turner and moves with a gait that is inconsistent with Mr. Turner's medical history. He has a chronic knee injury from his time in construction, which affects his stride. That's not visible in the video. Whispers rippled through the courtroom. Lillian watched Malcolm, his shoulders still squared, his eyes forward, not a single flinch. The prosecution tried to recover. Alan Mercer called the store clerk, Darren Blakely, to the stand. Darren, a young man in his 20s, recounted a chaotic scene. A man in a red hoodie yelling, pushing, grabbing cash. He claimed the man looked like Malcolm. Camille's cross-examination was surgical. You said it was dark, the man had the hood up, and you were startled, correct? Yes. Did you see his face? Not clearly. Could you pick him out of a photo lineup that night? I wasn't asked to. Camille glanced at the jury. So we have no physical evidence, a faulty timestamp, and an eyewitness who can't confirm identity. Yet, my client was arrested based solely on proximity and race. Mercer objected. Speculative. Withdrawn, Camille said quickly, but the damage was done. The jury had heard it. Then, in a bold move, Camille called Malcolm to the stand. Lillian's breath caught. Malcolm stood, the clinking of his ankle cuffs echoing like thunder in the silent room. He walked slowly, deliberately, each step weighted with years of battles lost and dignity reclaimed. He sat down, faced the jury, and took a breath. I didn't rob that store, he began. I was walking home after helping a friend move. I was tired, sore, and just wanted to get home. I didn't even know what happened until I was stopped. His voice cracked slightly. I've made mistakes in life. Got caught up with the wrong crowd when I was younger. Paid for that. Did my time. But that doesn't mean I did this. I've been trying to get my life right. Got a job, stay out of trouble, but it's like no one's willing to see that. A pause. You want to know what hurts the most? It's not the handcuffs or the cell. It's the feeling that no matter what I do, I'm already guilty in the world's eyes. Judge Carter's throat tightened. The room was utterly still. Malcolm glanced her way, just for a second, and in that glance, Lillian saw the boy she once knew, the boy who'd wanted nothing more than a chance. And she realized he was still that boy, just older, just tired, just waiting for someone to believe him. The courtroom fell into a heavy silence as Malcolm stepped down from the witness stand, his eyes locked on the floor, his face unreadable. Camille gave him a reassuring nod, but even she knew that no amount of legal brilliance could guarantee a jury's understanding. Now, all that remained were closing arguments. One final attempt to shape the narrative before the jury would decide his fate. Judge Lillian Carter called for a short recess, and the courtroom began to stir with whispers. Reporters leaned over to their colleagues, scribbling notes. The sound of leather shoes and rustling suits echoed as both legal teams regrouped. Lillian sat quietly on the bench, her gaze drifting to the empty stand, her gavel untouched. Her thoughts swirled in a storm of memories and responsibilities. Childhood laughter beneath the Louisiana sun, the pressure of the black robe she now wore, and the weight of knowing the man on trial once held her trust in his hands. 15 minutes later, the jury returned. Camille stood first, her posture upright, but her expression softened by exhaustion. She approached the jury box and took a breath, her voice low and steady. "This case is about more than what happened in a store late at night," she began. "It's about what happens when we stop looking at people as individuals and start seeing them as statistics." She walked slowly, her heels clicking softly against the polished wood. "Malcolm Turner is not perfect. He told you that himself. He's made mistakes, just like anyone else. But making mistakes doesn't make you a criminal forever." She paused in front of the jury. "This case is built on assumptions, on vague descriptions, altered surveillance footage, and fear. There is no physical evidence tying Mr. Turner to this crime, no stolen cash recovered, no fingerprints, no eyewitness who could say with certainty that it was him." Her voice grew firmer. "You have been given a choice. Do you convict a man based on fear and convenience, or do you uphold the principle that we are innocent until proven guilty? Malcolm Turner deserves the benefit of the doubt." Because doubt is exactly what we have here. Then it was the prosecution's turn. Alan Mercer straightened his jacket and stepped forward. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "we cannot let sympathy cloud our judgment. The victim in this case, a store clerk who was simply doing his job, was assaulted and robbed. Malcolm Turner was found nearby, fitting the description, with no alibi that could be corroborated. Yes, there are questions, but that doesn't mean there isn't guilt." He paced, voice rising. "What kind of message do we send if we let a man go simply because the evidence isn't perfect? This isn't about assumptions. It's about probability, about reality. The system works because we trust it to work." He pointed toward Malcolm, who sat motionless. "He was there. The store clerk identified him. He has a criminal record. That pattern means something." Lillian's hands tightened slightly around her gavel. That word, pattern, hit her like a slap. She had heard it before, too many times, in courtrooms, in board meetings, in whispers around dinner tables. Pattern. A word used to justify assuming the worst in someone before ever trying to see their best. She looked at Malcolm again. His face bore no expression, but his shoulders sat high, squared by quiet dignity. The jury was sent to deliberate. Hours passed. Lillian remained in her chambers for most of it, trying to focus, but her mind drifted. Her assistant, Denise, popped in to check on her, eyes filled with quiet concern. "You've been staring at that wall for an hour," Denise said gently. "Do you want some tea?" "No, thank you," Lillian replied softly. "You knew him, didn't you?" Denise asked, not unkindly. Lillian hesitated. "A long time ago." "Did you believe him?" Lillian turned toward her, her voice hushed and heavy. "I believed in the possibility of who he could become. That should be enough, shouldn't it?" Denise said nothing, only offered a soft smile before slipping out the door. When the jury returned, the courtroom buzzed with a sudden electricity. Reporters clutched pens like weapons, and Malcolm's hands trembled faintly in his lap. The foreperson, a woman in her 50s with kind but tired eyes, stood and unfolded the verdict. "In the matter of the state of Louisiana versus Malcolm Turner," she read, "we find the defendant not guilty." A collective gasp swept through the room. Some exhaled in relief. Others sat stone still. Lillian struck her gavel once to quiet the chamber, but her hands trembled for a fraction of a second before she regained control. Malcolm closed his eyes. Not in triumph, but in something closer to surrender. A moment of peace after a lifetime of battles. Camille placed a hand on his shoulder. She whispered something and Malcolm nodded, but didn't smile. His life wasn't suddenly healed, but at least it was still his. Judge Carter stood, her voice even. "Mr. Turner, you are free to go. Court is adjourned." But for Lillian, this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a reckoning, with the system, with her past, and with her own conscience. The courtroom emptied slowly, as if everyone inside was reluctant to leave the scene of something they knew had been bigger than just a trial. Malcolm Turner stood still for a long moment, surrounded by a defense team now caught between celebration and solemnity. Camille placed her files into her briefcase carefully, stealing a glance at her client. Malcolm's shoulders remained squared, but his eyes betrayed a deeper weight. This wasn't the kind of freedom that made you smile. It was the kind that made you wonder what it had cost to survive. Judge Lillian Carter remained seated at the bench, her robe hanging heavily over her shoulders as she watched Malcolm sign his release paperwork. Her hand hovered over her gavel, not because she needed to strike it again, but because it reminded her of what it symbolized: power, finality, and restraint. She didn't move, didn't speak, even when Denise returned to her side, gently collecting her documents with the quiet precision of someone who knew when not to ask questions. Just as Lillian began to rise from her seat, Malcolm turned. Their eyes met for the first time since the trial began. No courtroom decorum stood between them now. Just two people, tethered by history and divided by years of silence. He approached the bench, his steps slow but sure. Camille lingered behind, unsure whether to follow or wait. She stayed back, watching carefully, sensing that this moment was not hers to interrupt. "You don't owe me anything," Malcolm said, his voice low and level, "but I'd like to know why. Why didn't you say something?" Lillian's breath caught in her chest. Her fingers curled slightly against the wood of the bench. "Because I couldn't," she replied, her voice carrying the weariness of more than just the trial. "If I had acknowledged our past, if I'd shown bias, this entire case could have been thrown out. You might have never gotten the chance to be heard." Malcolm nodded slowly, his jaw tense. "Fair," he echoed, the word bitter and sharp. Funny how that word always means something different depending on who's saying it. "I know," Lillian said, the honesty in her tone softening the space between them. "I wish I'd done more back then. I wish I could have done more now." They stood in silence for a beat, each reflecting on a lifetime of choices, of roads taken and others denied. Then Malcolm's gaze softened, just slightly. "We were kids," he said. "Didn't know the world would split us like it did." "But it did," she answered. "And I let it." Malcolm exhaled through his nose. At least now, someone listened. Lillian's eyes flicked toward the jury box, now empty. "Because you made them listen." A trace of something like understanding passed between them. Not forgiveness, not yet, but recognition. Of loss, of survival, of the long, hard road they'd both walked alone. As Malcolm turned to leave, Lillian called after him, just above a whisper, "Malcolm." He stopped, but didn't turn back. "I'm proud of you," she said. He paused, then gave the slightest nod, before disappearing through the same doors he'd entered in shackles just days before. And this time, he walked out free. Judge Lillian Carter sat alone in her chambers, the silence wrapping around her like a robe heavier than the one she wore in court. The trial was over, but its echoes lingered in the corners of the room, on the edges of her desk, in the polished gleam of her gavel, in the vacant chair where Denise had quietly packed up her things and left for the evening. Lillian stared out the window, her eyes tracing the soft descent of dusk over Baton Rouge. For a long time she said nothing, did nothing. She just breathed, deeply and deliberately, as though learning how all over again. She had delivered a fair trial, at least by legal standards. The law had been upheld. But justice? That felt far more fragile, something lived, not written. And that realization sat heavy on her chest. Malcolm Turner's words haunted her. Funny how that word, fair, always means something different depending on who's saying it. He was right. She'd known it in her bones before he even said it. Sitting on that bench, wielding the authority to change lives with a single ruling, Lillian had always believed in impartiality. But life, she now understood more deeply than ever, wasn't impartial. The scales weren't balanced at birth, and silence, even when justified, wasn't always neutral. She pulled out an old photo album from her bottom drawer, something she hadn't opened in decades. There, tucked between pages stiff with age, was a faded photo. 2 kids under a magnolia tree. One black, one white, barefoot, grinning, and unaware that the world would soon tell them they didn't belong together. She closed the album softly, tears threatening at the corners of her eyes but never falling. There was still work to do. Lillian knew that her role wasn't just to preside over cases. It was to challenge a system that too often punished the wrong people and protected the wrong truths. She couldn't change the past, but she could change how she showed up from now on. And maybe, just maybe, the next Malcolm Turner who walked into her courtroom wouldn't have to carry quite as much weight alone. This story is more than just a courtroom drama. It's a deeply human reminder of how our past, our choices, and our silence shape the lives of others in ways we don't always see. Judge Lillian Carter's journey forces us to confront a hard truth, that justice is not always about laws and verdicts, but about listening, recognizing bias, and daring to act when it matters most. In today's world, where assumptions still too often dictate outcomes, this story calls on us to reflect, speak up, and treat one another with dignity, no matter what role we play. If this message moved you, if it stirred something within you, take a moment to like this video, subscribe for more powerful, eye-opening stories like this one, and share it with someone who needs to be reminded that compassion and accountability can and must go hand in hand. Thank you.